Hello, I'm King Link, and, well, I think it's time we take a look at a more recent game. Today we're going to discuss how Doom Eternal works. I think Doom Eternal needs no introduction, but let's give it one anyways. This is the newest game from id Software, and once again id Software has released a new first-person shooter that has made people stand up and take notice. With their recent release of Doom in 2016, they made a resurgence as one of the major names in the FPS market. Of course, id's history is a lot longer, and I'm going to leave a full discussion for that for perhaps another time or by a gaming historian, but to me, it is the company for shooters. I mean, this is Doom 1, Doom 2, Quake 1, Quake 2, and of course the great Quake 3 Arena. These guys just dominated the scene, not to mention they made the fantastic platformer of Commander Keen, and of course the game that made the FPS market blow up with Wolfenstein 3D. You know, id Software is a personal favorite company of mine, though I do also have to call out that the 20 or so guys who originally created the entire company and the FPS genre have mostly left the studio. The new team who released Doom 2016 seemed like they were just as good as the originals and still do. Now I will be focusing this video on Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. So to make this all simple, I will be calling Doom 2016 by the official name of Doom at times. Just to be clear though, this series is meant to talk about game design and gameplay decisions that studios have made. While I try not to put the morality of good or bad decisions on these choices, I intend to focus on different choices. I will, however, be criticizing some stuff in Doom Eternal, and I want to be clear here. I really enjoyed Doom Eternal, however, I think Doom is a better game in almost every way. If you like Doom Eternal more, that's perfectly fine, and feel free to let me know why down in the comments. Let me know what difficulty you played at as well, because I have a theory about that. Still, anyone should agree that there are significant design changes between these two games. We're going to be discussing those and take a deep dive to see what we can learn. Just please don't take this video as my full opinion on Doom Eternal. This is not intended as a review. I will actually be reviewing it probably next week. Let's get started with the biggest change, and that's going to be the story. I will try to minimize how much I talk about the actual story for the spoiler's sake, but there are significant changes here to the style of the story. To start with, the story isn't told the same way. In Doom 2016, you are the Doomslayer, and from the first moment until the end of the game, you stay in first-person mode as the Slayer. We will be directly comparing this to Doom Eternal, and there is a major change here. While you stay in first-person mode for the entire gameplay of Doom Eternal, many cutscenes are actually done in third-person, and that is a significant change. You can even feel it in the scenes I'm already showing. The choice of the first-person camera versus a third-person camera is an important choice in both gameplay and narrative design. In the first-person view, everything is happening to the player, and the main character is reacting as an avatar for you. First-person storytelling is extremely challenging in cutscenes, but Doom actually did a great job at giving the main player a feeling that he was the Slayer. It actually all starts with this early scene of blah-de-blah-de-blah exposition. When replaying this game for this video, I was already getting a little bit bored, and sure enough, the Doomslayer immediately grabs that screen, shoves it aside, and gets the player back to the action. That was an interesting but effective moment. That one moment starts to cement the idea that this unstoppable force of nature that you're viewing the entire game through is the player. You know, typically players don't want a lot of exposition, and you're playing Doom for the visceral thrills, not the story. id Software understood that, and multiple times the character responds as the players might, such as when he has to carefully take out the energy system for the Argent Tower, or smash it. This is again simple but effective, and once again players will understand the Slayer's mentality. There's even a little bit of an anti-corporate message here that works a lot better than almost anything in Outer Worlds did. In addition, Doom displays much of its story by showing these holograms who recite pieces of the story. While this is hardly a perfect system, it continues to keep the player in the first person and can even be used at times to show a scene that will lead to a puzzle, and it allows the player to retain control during these scenes. Now that's how a first-person story can work, and Doom actually did an amazing job to tell some story while keeping a silent protagonist as the main character. Now let's look again at Doom Eternal and see what happened. This is different. The third-person cutscenes means we're no longer the Doomslayer and have been made into an outside observer of these scenes. Even when it's third-person over the shoulder for most of the cutscene, there's a detachment from the character you're playing as, and in this case, it hurts the experience. What's strange is that the cutscenes could have been done in first person. I mean, why does this have to be in third person? That's an important question, especially because the scenes are not particularly enhanced by the third person view. And I think it understood the problem behind this. On screen now is the cutscene that greeted people at E3. The scene is in first person, and it's a great cutscene, of course. In fact, most of this level's scenes are done from the first person, and the scenes that aren't in first person weren't shown as part of the E3 demo. I don't think that was done to intentionally hide the fact that they're going to third person, but it does show an understanding of the change from its point of view. Now, Doom Eternal doesn't change everything in how it tells the story. The player still doesn't talk, and it's clear that Doom Eternal wanted to use that silent, badass protagonist as an avatar for the player. It does so for the most part, and the Doomslayer, well, he's pretty freaking awesome as you can guess. But Eternal is trying as hard as it can to push a story into the Doom series, and this is where Doom Eternal really struggles. It also was a major problem with the old Doom 3, but that's a completely different video. Now, the story in Doom was going on, but the player really only had to rip and tear. He didn't have to worry about a big galactic plot, and while there were heroes and villains in that story, they were just people to chase after as you slaughtered demons. Doom told an effective story, but it also tried to stay out of the way of its gameplay. So what went wrong here? There are two significant problems I have with Doom Eternal's story delivery. Now, the opening is the biggest problem in my opinion. A player coming off of Doom 2016 might know who the Sentinels are, but they might not even if they just played the game. That's not important from a design standpoint though. As a designer working on a sequel, you need to assume that you're meeting a gamer for the first time with your story. Doom Eternal doesn't do this. Instead, it starts with giving the player a Fortress of Doom and then tossing out terms like Sentinels, Hell Priests, and more. This doesn't really work, and it's important to understand why. The player has no connection to the story at this point, and the game makes an assumption that they will care without making them care. In Doom, the player is forced into a story, but for a while, they're just going to be going along with the story because they want to get to the next violent scene. That's also why the character of the Slayer is doing the same things. Again, it's well done to combine the main character's motivations with the expected player's reactions. Doom Eternal instead gives the Doomslayer motivations, but barely tries to explain these to the player beyond, go get that Hell Priest. What is a Hell Priest and who these characters are is unimportant to Doom Eternal's storytelling, even though they drop names everywhere. The game wants the player to understand the Sentinels, which really wasn't mentioned in the original game outside of the codexes that players likely didn't read. Now, pro tip for game designers. Players aren't going to read your flavor text, hard stop. Some might, like less than 10% will, but even in an RPG, unless you make it a loading screen or a piece of a puzzle, don't expect players to read it. Flavor text is good to have, but it's not the main story. By promoting the codexes into the main story here means players will likely have never read this, and that's even assuming they would remember it from a game that was out 4 years prior. Introducing a player to your story, especially in a sequel, should have been done better. A perfect example is on screen now of how Guacamelee 2 replays the final area of the original Guacamelee as its first level, and continues the story from there. Now this gives the player a point of context and allows them to understand what has happened in the story. This also allows the player to enter the new story with the grounding in the series as a whole. Guacamelee 2's story works because the player didn't have to remember the end of the previous game, it was right here at the beginning of the new game. The other big issue I have with Doom Eternal's story is that near the end of the game, they try to demystify the Doomslayer. In the third act, which I'm only going to be showing this scene here because I don't want to show too many spoilers, the game really tries to tie everything back to the opening of Doom 2016. And then there's also more that tries to tie it back to the original Doom's character. Then they try to explain why this character is so good at killing. Really, you did not have to do this. Everyone accepts that the Doomslayer, meaning the player, is an inhuman beast, but trying to demystify him into why he's so good at killing takes a lot of story, and it really kills the momentum when the game should be accelerating, not stopping for cutscenes. In fact, much of the third act is story heavy, and if there's one thing that Doom did well, and even Act 1 and Act 2 of Doom Eternal does well, is avoid telling long stories where it takes the control away from the character. The important takeaway from the third act is that by backloading so much of the story and making it into cutscenes instead of interactive story moments, it has changed the pacing at a critical moment and frustrates the player. So, what should we do to avoid these problems? Well, assume that your player has never played your series before, and assume you have to explain the story that you want them to care about, especially when you actually do care about it. Don't bog your action game down with massive stories, and there are games that are of course story-based, but if you're a sequel to a game without much story, stay on course. You also don't need to explain everything in one game. Now, let's move on to the gameplay, which is where most of Doom Eternal really should exist, and let's show Doom once more. In Doom, you had a lot of weapons and ammo, and a focus on murdering demons. You had a melee attack, a grenade that recharged, a pistol with infinite ammo, chainsaw that would give you a ton of ammo for all your guns, though you didn't really need to use your chainsaw, it just helped a lot. In fact, enemies would drop health and ammo when you get low on both. Doom Eternal, on the other hand, well, the thing is, I think Doom Eternal added too much. It feels like there wasn't a single subsystem that Doom Eternal said no to. Let's go through them just to give you the overwhelming amount. Doom Eternal has a melee that is now only really useful for glory kills. It does almost no damage. A dash charge that does the damage of a melee for some reason. Then we eventually get a chargeable blood punch, which is a super melee. No weapon has infinite ammo. Doom Eternal gives us a recharging chainsaw instead, which still drops a ton of ammo. And then the glory kills no longer give ammo. The ammo isn't that plentiful in Doom Eternal. You're supposed to use the chainsaw for that. You also get a flamethrower to get armor, and then eventually you get the crucible, which is this cool glowing sword. That, however, appears entirely too late, but that gives you an ability to instantly kill almost any enemy. And of course, there's also a freeze grenade that's pretty useful. Think we're done? No, because there's now 4 different types of upgrade currency, mastery challenges, and more. I'm going to avoid going through most of these, but there are massive amounts of new systems even here. And even ignoring these massive lists of upgrades, we're still not done. In addition, the double jump that's in the game comes in at the beginning of it and is used far more. A dash that can be used in midair that becomes a double dash eventually, a grappling hook as part of a weapon, wall climbing, and more. There is a full 3D platforming experience here on top of everything else. In fact, the only piece that isn't used almost constantly is the grappling hook, which oddly enough is never really used as a platforming element. I haven't, and I mostly won't be going into the new enemies, but just realize there's a ton of content to go over here, and I don't think it makes for a better game, at least not the amount of it. Doom was intensely simplistic fun. You have multiple weapons, and you make the enemies dead or they make you dead. There were new visceral glory kills and chainsaws that were absolutely fun, but none of this was necessary to use, and it all works out. Glory kills in Doom were important to get your health back, but overall they were just there for something awesome to see. Doom Eternal, of course, has changed a lot of this simple formula to the point where players are forced to be dealing with these subsystems. The ammo is lower, harder to find, and enemies don't drop it, as well as enemies are harder. You can read that as enemies being spongier, taking more bullet damage, of course, to the point where ammo is almost always running out, and now the chainsaws have to be used for that. Glory kills aren't a cool bonus anymore, but require to maintain your health or life. And flamethrowers are essential for armor. Of course, this all sounds like normal gameplay considerations, but it creates an important issue with Doom Eternal. You no longer can have interesting one-on-one boss fights in an arena for that specific boss, but instead you need a constant stream of fodder enemies to appear so players can chainsaw them and recover ammo. This is where the infinite ammo pistol might have worked, or enemies dropping ammo. But just in general, weapons in Doom Eternal feel far weaker to the point that you're chainsawing the enemies now, not just as part of a massive arsenal, but required because you need that ammo. And again, same thing with glory kills, and if you aren't using your flamethrower or your grenades effectively, you're missing a huge part of your weaponry, which was optional previously. This isn't even limited to having to use chainsaws. Where players can use almost any weapon on any enemy in Doom, Doom Eternal has certain synergies that are foolish to ignore. The floating gas bags of the Cacodemon could be blasted to shreds with most weapons, but instead a single frag grenade or a sticky bomb will stun them for a fast glory kill now. Using anything else just wastes ammo or risks massive damage from those Cacodemons. The Cubist has cannons built on his arm that needs to be taken out. This is either super easy with a single sniper bullet, or extremely hard with most other weapons, potentially impossible. The super version of the Cyber Mancubus gets armor which heavily increases their health, unless you want to use a bloody punch that turns them back into a normal Mancubus with similar health levels. Want to shoot it to death? Well, you're probably going to have a bad time because there are so many other things going on for you to effectively focus on any single enemy for long. This is a huge difference from Doom, which had a single enemy in many of the encounters that you would be focusing on and a few fodder enemies around. Now, there's so many super enemies, you will be overwhelmed if you're not using these systems. Now, the issue I have is not that these synergies exist. In fact, destructible pieces of enemies are a great addition to Doom Eternal. The issue that I have is that each synergy in Doom Eternal feels required rather than just desirable. Hitting the cannons on a Mancubus with almost any weapon likely won't remove it, but using that synergy of a sniper rifle is assured destruction, and a single bullet does it. In Doom, you have to kill enemies, but in Eternal, you're so often overwhelmed by the number of enemies that if you aren't effectively killing each target, you will fall quickly, and the effective path is using these matchups. Or else. There is just too much of this required complexity in Doom Eternal's system. It feels that the developers added and expanded every system here, but then they tried to rebalance the game at the end by increasing the difficulty to the point that each system has to be used by a player fully. Forcing players to use every system in a game would work at higher difficulties, but giving some breathing room at lower difficulties allows players to rise to the challenge and get used to these new systems. In Doom Eternal, even at lower difficulties outside of the easiest, if you aren't spamming almost every one of these available systems, you're going to be struggling a lot. The problem here is that the changes made the game more challenging to the best players, which is desirable, but inadvertently made every difficulty harder to anyone not wishing to hammer each new ability the second it comes up. The gameplay in Doom was well paced, but in Doom Eternal, the game feels like it intends the player to play as if they're in a MOBA, where the core gameplay loop is waiting for each of their abilities to recharge so they can hit those buttons again. That becomes frustrating to play in any other way than this. Now, speaking of frustrating, yes, Doom Eternal players know what I'm going to be bringing up, the Marauder. We all know the problem, and the thing is, I don't hate the Marauder. This first fight against him was actually a great moment and was quite challenging. You suddenly have an enemy that is on the same power level and tier as the player and can even summon a dog. It kind of works. This is a great fight and probably one of the high points of the game when they give the players such a challenging but fair fight. The fight made me legitimately afraid of facing the Marauder. And then Doom Eternal turns around and screws up immediately by making the Marauder appear hundreds of times before the end of the game. Okay, maybe not actually 100, but probably at least 20 times, not to mention when you once have to fight two Marauders at the same time. You know, making a boss into a normal enemy after the player has gained significant power can work in games. The Doom Hunter, for example, makes the transition in Doom Eternal. The problem is that the Marauder, who is a great boss again, is not made into a compelling normal enemy in the game. Instead, the Marauder is just a challenging fight every time he shows up, which is entirely too often. Now, if this only happened 2 or 3 times in the rest of the game, we wouldn't be talking about this. On the other hand, throwing the Marauder into an already overwhelming lineup of enemies is where the game starts to have serious problems, and yes, that is why it's in almost every review out there. Hell, the Tyrant is used less often than the Marauder and is more interesting to fight, and he wasn't even a boss in this game. No other enemy forces the player to focus solely on that one enemy when he appears, but the Marauder sure does. So what could have been done to fix the Marauder? Well, the key to making a boss into an enemy is allow the player to grow in power after that point. This is actually what happens with the Doom Hunter when the player has about half the arsenal and upgrades, and later with more weapons, the Doom Hunter is hardly a challenge. But the Marauder happened after the player has the BFG 9000. He's almost fully armed at this point and upgraded, so he's not going to have a huge power spike after this point. And the Marauder, well, he doesn't care. You see, the Marauder has an invincible shield, shotgun, thrown axe, and dog, and isn't a fun enemy to kill multiple times. The fact that he's mostly invincible to both the BFG 9000 and the Crucible means there's no easy way out. There's actually only a couple weapons that really work on him, mostly the super shotgun and the ballista, and that's a problem. But don't worry, there's actually a lot of potential here. Giving the player a scaled-down version of the boss to fight could have worked, even with themes. Making the boss into like a king character and the rest of the characters into his knights would have thematically worked well. The knights could have had weaker shields, no invulnerability to special weapons, weaker or no shields, slower attacks, or less health. But what made the Marauder a good fight as a boss makes him a bad enemy to throw in for the rest of the game, and that is why everyone is talking about him in a negative way. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about the new features in the Marauder, but we need to talk about map design and, well, that platforming. Doom is not Mario 64. I know that's controversial, but the addition of platforming features into Doom seems like a good idea on paper. The more I play with him, though, the more I kept coming back to a single thought. This is not a good addition. If I was playing Doom 2016 and all that was added was platforming, I probably would still question its role, but that's an important sign. For Doom Eternal, it's not just platforming, but that addition of double dashes in midair, the double jump, the monkey bars that fling the player into the ears. I know that the double jump was in Doom, but it's more egregious here. What started as a way to entertain the player between combat arena rooms becomes an exercise in distracting the player on almost every level. These platforming sections become puzzles, where players have to figure out what the developer was thinking and where they expect you to go next, and that almost always backfires from a design standpoint. If you're finding that players have to ever think, what was the designer thinking at any point in your game, whether it be an action game, puzzle game, or a platformer, you've made a bad mistake and should fix that. The hand of the designer should be hidden, not the source of the puzzle itself. And unsurprisingly, it's a baffling addition here as well. The platforming here, though, wouldn't be bad if it was limited to a couple times per level, but between almost any room of importance, Doom Eternal goes back to the feature and gives the player a mini puzzle of platforming, a puzzle that they probably will get tired of before long. By the way, most of these videos come from a single level early in the game. That tells you how often that you see it. Part of the issue is that the levels in Doom Eternal are extremely linear. You have to go to each corridor and proceed through it, and while there might be a secret or an item to be found, each one is only a couple steps off that main path. At the end of the day, outside of the combat arena, the map is extremely linear, and combat arenas are usually a single route. Now, let's compare this to Doom again, and you have a vastly different game, as you can see. In Doom, players could avoid certain encounters, and maps allowed more non-linear progression and doubling back at times, such as the Foundry, where you have to destroy 4 different nests in whichever order you choose. Now, I think we can say this was changed because people got lost in the map of Doom. I know I actually got lost once while recording this footage, and I've seen that reported many times as well. The objective indicator in Doom was often multiple rooms away, hundreds of meters, and usually telling the player where something was, but expecting him to find the path to that location. Technically, that could be done on the minimap at times, but I guess players didn't use that. I know I still got stuck. So, in Doom Eternal, the objective indicator is almost always showing which exit the player needs to use to leave the current room. Doom Eternal's level progression is the opposite of its combat, where its combat is shoving everything possible at the player and tries to overwhelm them, making them have to use all the systems. The level progression becomes extremely linear to the point that players are expecting a platforming section after every encounter. And spoiler, they're always right. So, what can be done about these features? Well, the 2 major takeaways for me is to add in new features to the game sparingly, or make sure that the players won't have to use all the features at once. Also, consider that difficulty should tailor the experience, not just change the AI or health numbers or damage numbers. The top tier players can be overwhelmed with the gameplay systems, but players playing on lower difficulties are not going to be as good, and the game should make allowances so that they don't have to use every system all at once to win. Don't be afraid of making cuts either. Not everything you try to do will be a success, and in the case of the upgrade system, especially in Doom Eternal's case, if you have something doing almost the same thing, don't be afraid to choose one or the other. Personally, I think removing all these suit upgrades here and coming up with a few new weapon upgrades instead of copying the ones from Doom would have been a better use of their time. A simple rule for game design: make less stuff, fewer choices for what you're developing, and make sure that each of those upgrades and features are more exciting and higher quality, and that makes for a better game. Now, this has already been a long video. I want to talk about one more section as fast as I can. There's a piece of the game that puzzles me. It's the RPG elements of the level of the player and the season pass. I have a lot to say, but I'll make it just this. The RPG elements barely add anything to the game, but the rewards are worse. They're just customizations that could and do come when you reach certain milestones or achievements, making a level system doesn't feel really needed here. The season pass, though, is worse, and it's because it feels like it's a leftover from the point that the game had microtransactions or was attempting to follow the trends of Fortnite. Season passes are a way to get players to play more by FOMO, fear of missing out, but a better solution is just to simply make better games that people want to come back and play more of. The season pass only creates an opportunity to grind, as you're seeing on the screen, but this isn't compelling gameplay, sadly, to load a checkpoint again and again just to get some small number higher. I could go on about microtransactions and not following trends, and I think I'll save that for another day. Doom doesn't have microtransactions, but it has the hand of microtransactions here still, but the season pass doesn't make sense in general, and it's a strange addition. Alright, so what have we learned here? The 3 biggest points I wanted to make are simple. Treat players like they're new for any sequel, especially with your story. Consider what you add and remove from your game. You don't want to add too much, but you want to make sure everything you add to the game is a necessary system, a major improvement, or high quality. And finally, don't chase trends in general. That's just not good design. I can go into more of that later. We've kind of been all over the design of Doom Eternal, and while writing this, I kind of wish I named the series Design Review. The thing is, like I said at the beginning, I like Doom Eternal. The combat here is great when it all clicks, the gameplay is intense, the levels look amazing, the base ship is actually fun to hang out in, the collectibles are a blast to chase, the ability to replay missions with cheats enabled is fun. The Doom Eternal, just in general, isn't a bad game, but there are a few things that Doom does better. If I actually was to review this game, I'd probably give this an 8 out of 10, but at the same time, I would give Doom a 9 or a 10 out of 10. If you came in here to know what I thought, I would say if you enjoyed Doom, definitely give this game a go, but there's still enough here where I shake my head as I replayed the game. Now, I will be reviewing this game further next time as I review a bunch of games I've played recently, and that will be a much faster video, so stay tuned for that. And I realize this has been a super long video for me. I tried to make it faster, but clearly failed, and there was tons to talk about. If you, however, have enjoyed what you've seen, consider subscribing, ringing that bell, and feel free to bring up anything I missed, or what your favorite part of Doom Eternal is. I'd love to hear that. There's so much I want to talk about with this game that I could do a complete other video on the positives of change as well. It's just a very interesting game. I'm going to be popping up my old videos on microtransactions and grinding, especially with that last section, and I hope you enjoy them. Until then, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.